I was standing alone in a small plaza in Toledo, with church bells ringing and the smell of coffee drifting out of a nearby cafe. And for the first time in a very long time, no one needed anything from me. No students, no kids, no schedule. No expectations, just me. And I remember thinking, who am I when I'm not performing for everyone else? That question didn't come from a museum. It didn't come from a tour guide. It came from Spain itself. Today, I want to talk about something deeper than sightseeing, because Spain doesn't just give you beautiful photos, it gives you back to yourself. And if you let it, it can completely reshape who you are when you get home. Welcome to Cheryl's Travel Blueprint, where we don't just plan trips, we design experiences that change us. I'm Cheryl, founder of Nostalgic Travel, retired Spanish teacher turned travel advisor, and lifelong believer that travel is one of the most powerful tools for personal growth. Today, we're going beyond the flamenco shows and cathedral tours. We're talking about transformation. Spain is not gentle. It's dramatic, rugged, and layered, and the landscape itself invites you into a process of shedding. Thousands of people walk across northern Spain every year carrying a backpack, but what they end up leaving behind has nothing to do with what's inside it. Let me show you what I mean. It's 6:12 a.m., the sky is still gray, your legs are stiff, your backpack feels heavier than it did yesterday. You haven't checked your email, you haven't looked at the news. No one knows where you are except the other pilgrims walking quietly ahead of you. And suddenly, there's nothing to hide behind. No schedule, no meetings, no distractions. Just the sound of your boots on gravel and your own thoughts. And that leads to a question most of us avoid asking. What would happen if you walked 15 miles a day with nothing but your thoughts? Most of us don't realize how much we're carrying until something forces us to slow down. Most people think the Camino de Santiago is religious, and for some people it absolutely is. But that's only part of the story. Some people walk for faith, some walk after divorce, some after retirement, some after loss, and some people walk simply because they feel stuck. The Camino doesn't ask us why we're there, it just keeps letting you put one foot in front of the other until you figure it out. Now, I've been on sections of the trail myself, but I haven't walked the full distance yet. That's to come. But I know several people who have, including a former student of mine, and listening to their stories is fascinating because almost all of them say the same thing. They started the Camino thinking it was about the destination, and somewhere along the way they realized it wasn't about Santiago at all. It was about everything that happened before they got there. Because the Camino de Santiago isn't just a hiking trail, it's a stripping away. Blisters humble you, silence confronts you, and the repetition of walking mile after mile, day after day, has this strange way of clearing mental clutter. The terrain forces you to slow down, and in that physical discomfort, something begins to shift internally. And it often starts with something surprisingly simple, your backpack. When you begin the Camino, you pack what you think you need. Extra clothes, extra gear, things for just in case. But by day 3, that backpack starts to feel heavy. And suddenly you're asking yourself, why did I pack this? Why am I carrying that? Do I actually need it? And somewhere along those miles, those questions start getting deeper. Because eventually the question isn't about your backpack anymore. It's about your life. What else am I carrying that I don't need anymore? Old expectations? Outdated identities? Roles that no longer fit? And that's where people start realizing something powerful. Maybe they're overpacking their lives the same way they overpack their bags. Let me pause here for a second and ask you something. If you had to pack your entire life into one backpack, what would you leave behind? A job that no longer excites you? Other people's expectations? A version of yourself that doesn't fit anymore? That's the kind of question that starts showing up when you walk long enough. And here's something interesting about that, that almost everyone who walks the Camino talks about. There's always a day when you question why you started. Maybe it's raining, maybe your feet hurt, or maybe you're exhausted and you think to yourself, what was I thinking? But that day, the day you want to quit, often teaches you more about yourself than the cathedral waiting at the end. Because the real transformation doesn't happen when you arrive in Santiago, it happens in the quiet miles no one sees. The early mornings, the lonely stretches of trail, the long conversations with strangers who somehow feel like lifelong friends. That's where the shift happens. And that's why so many people walk the Camino during transition points in life: graduation, retirement, divorce, career changes, moments where they feel like they're standing between two versions of themselves. The Camino becomes a bridge between those versions because it's not really about getting somewhere. It's about walking out of one version of yourself and slowly walking into another. And here's the beautiful thing about Spain. You don't actually have to walk the Camino to experience that kind of transformation. Spain has a way of creating those quiet miles for you, even if you never step foot on the trail. And that starts to reveal itself in the landscapes and the architecture and the layers of history that exist all across the country, because Spain in many ways is a country built on reinvention. And when you start looking closely, you realize something fascinating. Its architecture mirrors the way we reinvent ourselves, and that's where the journey gets even deeper. Now, the Camino teaches you about letting go, but Spain has another landscape that teaches you something equally powerful, the Sierra Nevada, and what it teaches you is this. Sometimes transformation isn't about what you leave behind. Sometimes it's about discovering what you're capable of carrying. The Sierra Nevada doesn't care who you are back home. Your job title is irrelevant. Your social media following doesn't matter. And your resume is meaningless. When you're standing in the mountains, none of those things help you. The mountains reduce you to your most human form. Breathing, stepping, continuing. And something interesting happens when the noise of everyday life disappears. You start realizing how much of your identity is built around things that don't really matter in the natural world. Deadlines, status, comparison. The mountains quietly strip all of that away, not in a harsh way, just by refusing to acknowledge it. And that can feel uncomfortable at first, because when the distractions disappear, you're left with something very simple: your limits. Or at least what you think your limits are. But here's the fascinating part. When people spend time in landscapes like the Sierra Nevada, they often discover their limits aren't as fixed as they believed. You take a step, then another, and then another. And before long, you've climbed farther than you thought you could. Not because you suddenly became stronger, but because you stopped telling yourself you couldn't. And that's when something shifts. You realize that strength isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, strength is simply this: breathing, stepping, continuing, even when things feel hard. Spain's landscapes have a way of turning ordinary effort into something almost alchemical. Pressure turns into clarity. Balance or distance turns into perspective. Effort turns into confidence. And somewhere along the way, you stop thinking about yourself as someone who couldn't do something and start realizing you're someone who already did. And that realization doesn't stay in the mountains. You bring it home. Suddenly, that difficult conversation feels easier. The new opportunity feels less intimidating because a small part of your brain remembers something important. You climbed the mountain. And that's what makes Spain so fascinating as a travel experience. Its landscapes don't just give you beautiful views, they quietly reshape the way you see yourself. But the most surprising place where this transformation shows up in Spain isn't the mountains, it's the architecture. Because when you start looking closely at Spain's buildings, you begin to see a country that has reinvented itself over and over again, and that story mirrors something very human. Now, here's something fascinating about Spain. It's a country built in layers. Roman foundations, Moorish palaces, Gothic cathedrals, modernist masterpieces. At first glance, it might just look like beautiful architecture, but if you slow down and really look, Spain is telling you a story about reinvention. Take a place like the Alhambra in Granada. The arches, the intricate patterns, the flowing courtyards, all built during centuries of Islamic rule. Then travel north and walk inside the Mezquita in Córdoba, a forest of red and white arches that once echoed with Islamic prayer. But right in the middle of it today stands a Catholic cathedral built centuries later. Two civilizations layered in the same space. Two histories sharing the same walls. And then you go to Barcelona, you walk into the Sagrada Familia. Sunlight pours through stained glass like something almost otherworldly, and suddenly you realize something. Spain never erased its past. It built on top of it. That's a powerful idea because when people talk about personal transformation, they often imagine wiping the slate clean, starting over, becoming someone completely different. But Spain shows us something more realistic and honestly more hopeful. Reinvention doesn't mean erasing who you were. It means building on the foundation that already exists. Think about it. Every experience you've had becomes part of the structure. Your career, your relationships, Your successes, your failures, they're all part of the architecture of your life. You don't demolish them, you redesign around them. And when you walk through Spain, you start noticing this pattern everywhere. Ancient stones beside modern cafes, medieval streets beside contemporary art museums, history and innovation living side by side. Spain isn't frozen in time, it's constantly evolving. And that realization can be surprisingly liberating because it reminds you that you're allowed to evolve too. Maybe you're in a second act of your life. Maybe you're redefining what success looks like. Maybe you're realizing that the version of yourself that you built 10 years ago doesn't quite fit anymore. Spain quietly gives you permission to renovate. And sometimes these moments of realization don't happen in dramatic places. They happen in very ordinary moments. Sitting alone at a cafe, walking through a quiet plaza, listening to a language you only partially understand. And that's when another kind of transformation begins. The shift from being alone to becoming self-reliant. And that might be one of the most empowering travel experiences of all. One of the mistakes travelers sometimes make in Spain is trying to see too much too quickly. Madrid one day, Barcelona the next, Seville after that. But Spain isn't a country that reveals itself quickly. It's a place that rewards slowing down, sitting in a plaza longer than you planned, taking a train instead of rushing through an airport, lingering over dinner while the evening stretches late into the night. Spain teaches you something that modern life often forgets. Not every meaningful experience has to be efficient. Sometimes the most transformative moments happen when you stop trying to optimize everything. Let me ask you something. If you could step away from your routine for 2 weeks and spend time somewhere like Spain, what part of your life might you start seeing differently? Would it be your priorities, your pace of life, your definition of success? Travel has a way of giving us just enough distance from our normal environment to notice things we might otherwise overlook. And sometimes that perspective is exactly what we need. When I was teaching Spanish, I used to tell my students that language isn't just vocabulary and grammar. It's a doorway into a completely different way of seeing the world. And Spain is a perfect example of that. The culture values long conversations, shared meals, community. And when travelers immerse themselves in that environment, even for a short time, it can change how they think about connection, time, and what really matters. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment because if this conversation is sparking your curiosity about Spain, there are some wonderful ways to experience these places more deeply. One option I often recommend is Get Your Guide, which offers a huge variety of guided tours and excursions throughout Spain. Whether it's walking tours through historic neighborhoods, day trips into the countryside, food tours, or cultural experiences, it's a great way to go beyond just seeing a place and actually understanding it. I've included a link in the description if you'd like to explore what's available. And just so you know, if you book something through that link, I may receive a small commission at no extra cost to you. It simply helps support the channel and allows me to keep creating content like this. Of course, if you prefer something more personalized, that's exactly what I do at Nostalgic Travel. I love helping travelers design experiences that go beyond sightseeing and really connect them with the culture. Now let's get back to the journey because Spain still has another lesson to reveal, and this one might be the most personal of all. Let's talk about solitude, because Spain has a way of introducing you to yourself. But there's another reason Spain changes people, and it has nothing to do with mountains, architecture, or history. There's another moment that happens in Spain that surprises a lot of travelers, and it's not something dramatic, it's actually very quiet. It usually happens in a small plaza or a cafe, or maybe on a train. You're sitting there alone, you can hear conversations around you in Spanish, and if you're not a native speaker or a fluent speaker, you understand a few words, but not everything. You order a coffee in slightly imperfect Spanish, and for a moment you realize something. No one here knows who you are. And at first that can feel a little uncomfortable, because back home, we're used to our identities being reinforced constantly through our job titles, our routines, our roles in other people's lives. But when you travel somewhere unfamiliar, especially alone, those things fall away and you're left with a very simple question. Who am I when no one expects anything from me? That moment can feel unsettling, but it can also be incredibly freeing because suddenly you're navigating the world in a very different way. You figure out the train system, you ask someone for directions, you order dinner, you adapt, and each small success builds something powerful, self-trust. And what's fascinating is how quickly that self-trust grows. At the beginning of a trip, everything feels unfamiliar. You double-check the map, you worry about making mistakes, you wonder if you're doing things right. But after a few days, something shifts. You start walking with more confidence. You linger longer in places, and you stop trying to control every detail. You start participating in the rhythm of the place. And that's when travel becomes something deeper than sightseeing. Because you realize something important. You're capable of navigating unfamiliar situations. You can adapt. You can figure things out. And that realization is incredibly empowering. Because once you know you can handle unfamiliar places, you start realizing you can handle unfamiliar situations in life too. That difficult decision you've been putting off, that opportunity you've been hesitating to pursue, that new chapter you've been quietly considering. Travel has a way of showing you that you're more adaptable than you thought. And Spain is particularly good at creating these moments. Long dinners that stretch for hours, late night conversations in plazas, train rides through landscapes that invite reflection. Spain moves at a rhythm that gives you time to notice things, including yourself. And when you return home after a trip like that, you often realize something surprising. You didn't just bring home photos. You brought home a slightly different version of yourself. A version that knows you can step into unfamiliar places, you can trust yourself, and you can keep evolving. And when you look back at everything Spain offers, the Camino, the mountains, the architecture, the quiet moments in plazas, you start to see the pattern. Each experience invites you to shed something, discover something, or become something. Which brings us back to the bigger idea behind this journey. Spain isn't just a destination. Sometimes it's a mirror. When you step back and look at everything Spain offers, a pattern starts to emerge. The Camino teaches you about letting go. The mountains remind you of your strength. The architecture shows you that reinvention is possible. And those quiet moments in plazas and cafes can help you rediscover something we often forget in our busy lives. Who we are when that noise fades away. Spain has this remarkable way of creating space for reflection. Not by forcing it, but simply by slowing life down enough that you begin to notice things again. The rhythm of a long dinner, the sound of footsteps on an old stone street, a conversation with someone you may never see again, and in those small moments, something shifts. You start seeing your own life a little differently. Because travel like this isn't really about sightseeing, it's about perspective. It's about stepping outside your routine long enough to realize that the story you're living can always evolve. Spain doesn't just show you beautiful places. Sometimes it quietly reminds you that you're allowed to change too. And maybe that's the real gift of travel. You leave home thinking you're going somewhere new, but what you often discover is a new version of yourself. If Spain has been calling your name for a while, maybe this is the moment to start listening. And if you'd like help designing a journey that goes beyond a checklist of attractions, something rooted in culture, history, and meaningful experiences, that's exactly what I love helping people create through nostalgic travel. You can schedule a conversation with me using the link in the description. And if you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who might be dreaming about their own journey of discovery. Because sometimes the most meaningful souvenir you can bring home from a trip is the person you've been becoming along the way. So if you've been feeling like you're in between versions of yourself, if you've entered a second act, if you want more than sightseeing, maybe Spain isn't just a destination, maybe it's a mirror. At Nostalgic Travel, I don't design surface-level itineraries. I design experiences rooted in culture, history, language, and space to reflect. If that's the kind of journey you're craving, let's talk. Schedule a consultation, subscribe to the channel, and if this episode spoke to you, share it with someone who might need a second act too. Because sometimes the most important souvenir you bring home is the person you've become.